Dear colleagues, we are continuing our event, our online conference, Cultural Relations Managing the Uncertainty. And I'm very happy, pleased, and honored to represent our next keynote speaker of today's event. This is Professor David John Snowden, management consultant and researcher in the field of knowledge management and the application of complexity science, and founder and chief scientific officer at Cognitive Edge. David is well known worldwide for developing very interesting and impactful, I would say, framework which is called Cynefin. I hope I pronounced it correctly. And as far as I know, this is a Welsh word. I would like to welcome Dave on this virtual stage. And with him, we will be talking about how to navigate complexities in the creative and cultural industries with the Cynefin framework, and how it can be practically used to make decisions in times of uncertainty and in the situations of crisis and chaos. So, Dave, thank you for joining us, and I welcome you on the stage.
Thank you for the introduction. And I'm sorry I can't be with you physically. I've spent happy weeks in Ukraine over the years, and it was nice to be back again, right? However, so I'll continue you from what I want to do is talk a little about the Cynefin framework. That's the goal here, and explain what it is. And then I want to talk through the principles and the European Union field guide to managing in complexity in a crisis, which I wrote and which is based on the Cynefin framework. So I'll talk about some aspects. Some of the work we're now doing within the European Union on the role of media and the arts in sense making, which is an open participative program, so that may interest people. Yeah. Thing is, my apologies if I speak too fast. I am Welsh, not English, right? So the other day I had my Ukrainian flag up behind me during conference calls because we have a basic principle is we just want the English to lose. But the trouble is we speak English very, very quickly. If I start to speed up too much, then message to me outline and I'll slow down. The Cynefin framework has been around for about 21 years now. Its origins were in knowledge management, and in particular, understanding the balance between informal networks and formal systems. And the original research on that was done when I worked at IBM, where I had a free-floating research role, which was quite fun, really. And one of the things we found on that, which I'll come back to later, is informal networks are actually more important than formal systems into decision making. So we started to look at the nature of those informal networks and how they were formed, and that brought me into networks, which into science, and so we went on in that direction. So then we start the Cynefin framework, and then we'll move on. So the Cynefin framework comes from a natural science background, not a social science background. So from a natural science background, if physics or chemistry, fundamentally different types of system, ordered systems, complex systems, and chaotic systems. And by the way, full agreement on the language yet, so I will define my terms. So an ordered system is one which has a high level of constraint, which produces predictability and structure in terms of the way that we work. So, for example, in the UK, we drive on the left-hand side of the road. In the Ukraine, from memory, you drive on the right-hand side of the road. These are structures that read within society, which give stability and stability in terms of the way we manage our life. And this is where we have things like best practice and standard processes and standard procedures. And effectively, those processes act as what is called a governing constraint. So they give freedom within a boundary zone. So you can't vary from that boundary. And that's the core principle. And these are extremely valuable. They're critical in manufacturing, critical in terms of a whole bunch of stuff on society in terms of providing a degree of uncertainty. They don't have the two types of systems very well. So a chaotic system, where there isn't an agreement on the language. So I define chaotic system as without any effective control, which means it's completely random. And that means in human systems that these are only ever temporary. So when COVID came along, it created what we call a temporary collapse into chaos. But very quickly, governments and other actors started to create constraints. There's a phrase in English, nature abhors a vacuum, and that comes from physics. Society's system constraints. It's why anarchism never really worked. So a collapse into chaos, critical is the ability to realize had that collapse because you may act quickly, decisively, not to resolve the position, but to create options. So, for example, in the COVID crisis, you can see this with the New Zealand Prime Minister. She actually broke her own laws, overruled the Supreme Court. It was too late to create a rapid and immediate lockdown on New Zealand so that people couldn't move in or out or move in any way. Now, at that time, the evidence didn't say that had to happen. But it did say if you did that, it would keep options open in the future, and that's the decision to make a crisis. Your focus is options open, closing down, and not on resolving the position. So if you accidentally, that's a real issue. If you deliberately go into it, that can enhance decision making, and I'll talk about that in a second. Move on to the field guide. And the third type of system is a complex adaptive system. The relative discovery and science, you can basically trace to people like Kaufman in biology, Pridgen in chemical physics, even Russian mathematicians if you go back far enough. But it's fundamentally a 20th century phenomenon. Yeah? And it's sometimes known as the science of inherent certainty. Where there is no linear relationship between cause and effect. So the same won't happen in the same price by accident. And there are good metaphors for this. If you've ever gone out walking in the country and you're off a clear tourist path, then it's very easy to walk into a small woodland, get tangled up in all sorts of briar patches and brambles, and it's a phrase to Gerard. Complex is like bushes in a thicket is a English word for a word, and bramble bush is sort of long things with lots of sharp thorns on them, which produce some beautiful berries. Right? And my hobby is walking, and I go walking with some friends, and one of them paths. So he's constantly leading us into these thickets, and I now carry a large knife or machete to get us out. The point is that everything in a complex system is entangled with everything else. And if you ever get into one of those thickets, all right, those small woodlands, you'll find you pull one thing and something else hits the back of your neck. So everything is connected with everything else, but you can't see the connections and you can't disentangle the system. You can't reduce it back to its component parts. Yeah, so you have to deal with it as it is. And that's most human systems are complex. And the type of constraint they have is that everything is connected with everything else, but very little is contained. The difference between order and complexity is that in an ordered system, everything is contained, so you have ability. In a complex system, everything is connected. All of the connections can't be known, and then can only be by action. So the three fundamental types of systems. If you want to metaphor this, you can think about solid and gas. Solid is my metaphor for order. Yeah, if I've got a cup of coffee here, yeah, which I just had made before this. The cup is solid. If I place it on my desk, it doesn't move. Yeah. On the other hand, the coffee in it is liquid, and it has to be contained by the cup. So it would otherwise spread out very quickly. So that's my metaphor for complexity. And if I heat it up to the point where it becomes gas, then it's almost impossible to contain it. So complex solid liquid, yeah, is a good way of thinking about it. And if you go back to your science, if you heat water to 100 degrees centigrade at a constant pressure, it doesn't become steam for a period of time. You have to put more heat in, more energy in, before it goes through a phase transition. When it snows, the atmosphere heats up a bit, because in order for the liquid water in the clouds to become snowflakes, it has to throw out heat. Now, those are called phase transitions, and they involve either the release of energy or the input of energy. So fundamentally, order, complex types of system, and within those types of system, you have this phase shift between them. So Cynefin is fundamentally about those three. Now, the other, you remember your high street, your high school, is that there's a thing, triple point, which is a balance between pressure and temperature, which point is probable. Something can be solid, liquid, or gas. And that's the central domain of Cynefin, which is really important, which at this level is called the Apparatic Domain. Now, apparatic is not a familiar word, it's a Greek word. I'll define that, and it's an important one. It also goes back to a philosopher called Derrida. So basically, what Derrida said is if you know the answer to a question, it's not a question. It's a process. A question that you can't resolve, thinking differently about the problem. And the purpose of the domain of Cynefin. It's basically, you want to get into a position where you have to gain a different perspective, think of things differently, and then you can decide what aspects of your problem are ordered, what aspects are complex, and what aspects are chaotic, or should be chaotic, or are chaotic, or whatever. And that's the fundamental principle. And I'm not going to go into these, but we can send you a link later. There are various ways you can create these apparatic moments. Some of them are linguistic, so using paradoxes, for example. Some of them are aesthetic, so we have 7 different ways in which we use art to get people to think differently about a problem. And some physical, people in situations where they just take the old for granted. So there are physical aporia, linguistic aporia, and aesthetic aporia that you can then use. As I say, as I come towards the end of this talk, I'm going to talk about the work we're doing with the European Union on using art in culture wars to get people to think differently about their current and future situation. So that concept of the unanswerable question, which forces you to think differently, is really important to decision making under a crisis. The other thing to say on complexity is the critical thing on complexity is not to define what you should do, but you start off by defining what is not possible. This is called a counter. So if you define what is possible, that narrows the range of things you have to work out. And within that range, you start to create what are called constructors. So things which are designed to test what's possible in the system and then see what patterns emerge. In simpler language, we call that multiple parallel safe to fail experiments. So if when you get to discuss a complex situation, you'll generally find that 4 or 5 people with strong opinions about what happened, all of whom are supported by evidence. That's one of the ways that you know it's complex. If experts from different backgrounds have very different opinions. They're all supported by the evidence, and you can't resolve that conflict in the time frame for decision. That means it's complex. So what each of those get given a short, small amount of funding and a limited time to run a safe to fail experiment or probe. And critically, those experiments run in parallel. And what generally happens is none of them succeed or fail. They combine, they refine, they disrupt space. And then what we call a pattern of future possibility becomes evident. You can see what you should do next, and that you go and do. If you want another metaphor for this, I sometimes call this the Frozen 2 strategy for complexity. So if you haven't seen the movie, it's a Disney movie, Frozen 2, it's worth going to watch. It's a real explanation of theory, ironically, for young children. And then in it at one where Anna, who I think is the real heroine, to be honest, of that film, sings, you know, she's facing dark and despair and uncertainty, doesn't want to know what the future is going to be. And she sings, "Do the next right thing." And that's actually what it is about. You can't do the future stuff. So what you actually have to do is work out what the next right thing is. If you want scientific jargon for this, it's called an adjacent possible. It's the thing next to where you are, where you can make a step, and then you can look again, make another step, look again, make another step. But it's a lot safer to make several of those move in parallel, so you get a full perspective. So that's parallel failed experimentation is key. And the other aspect about is that we normally split order in two. And this isn't a phase shift boundary, it's a gradient. Yeah. Where the relationship between cause and effect is clear, the relationship between cause and effect is complicated. So fundamentally, we end up with clear, chaotic, and then the central domain, which is apparatic, or if you want simpler words, it's confused, but it's deliberate confusion, so that you see different possibilities. So run through that in terms of a simple decision model, and you can read the Harvard Business Review article on this. Every 1st of March is St. David's Day, who's the Welsh saint. So every David's Day, the 1st of March, I publish an update on Connect blog, so you can go back and look at those. Yeah. But so if the situation is clear, that's a subset of order, then my decision is sense, categorize, respond. I'm in the UK, what category of country is? It's the category of countries that drive on the left. Okay, I will drive on the left. It's nice and easy. And that's the legitimate domain of best practice. And there the constraints are pretty rigid. In complicated, the relationship between cause and effect may be self-evident to a deep expert, but not self-evident to the decision maker. So in that space, I have to do some sort of analysis, yeah, before I make a decision. So instead of sense, categorize, respond, which is what I do in clear, I sense, analyze, respond, which is the approach point in complicated, and I apply good practice, not best practice. And that's a really important distinction. In best practice, there's one right way to do things. In good practice, there are multiple right ways to do things. Yeah. And provided you've got the right expertise, you should have the freedom to movement. It's still contained. For example, you know, I've had surgery months ago. Look at my head, you'll see 2 scars. I had a massive brain bleed. So they drilled holes in my head and drained the blood. The oldest operation in human history, where it goes back 8,000. Originally done by shamans, I claim that mystical authority. But there were 2 schools of thought about what you should. One was to leave a plastic tube in the brain to drain off any fluid. The other was to close out the skull and take another afterwards. Different surgeons have different views on that. Both of them, neither of them. The diversity is actually quite useful. So that's good practice, not best practice. In the domain, you probe sense respond, but critically you probe parallel, not in sequence. You don't do one thing to see if you can get it right. You do several things in parallel. And practice, and this is the second word I'm going to introduce, which is new, is exaptive, another name for which is radical repurposing. So let me illustrate that a bit, because this is one of the key roles of art in human evolution. The culture, this is really look in evolutionary history, find that all dinosaurs have in this in the fossil remains in North America. And the feathers evolved for warmth, sexual display. And then one small group of dinosaurs, very rapid running dinosaurs, small and they had to escape, from the big ones, developed skin flap under their forepaws. It's fairly obvious that was to better display their colourful feathers, colourful from the laser spectrometry, in order to attract a mate. And of course, if those dinosaurs then started to run very quickly, their forelimbs went out, they started to hide, and that's how we got flight. So a trait which evolved for one function, it adapted over time for sexual display and warmth. Under conditions of stress, it doesn't adapt, exapt, flight. The cerebellum, the base of your brain, evolved in higher apes to manipulate fine manipulation of muscles in fingers, presumably so that you could pick seeds from seed pods and use tools better. It then exapts, it doesn't adapt in human beings, actually control grammar in language. That's too deep to happen in a linear way. It requires a non-linear exaptive process. Now, that also applies to technology. So, for example, in 1945, a Raytheon engineer maintaining the magneto of a radar machine noticed that a chocolate bar melted in his pocket. He realized the significance of this. A lot of people hadn't. Several other people had observed it and just swore and got trousers clean. Significance. So he put a metal box around the magneto and we got the first microwave oven. If you look at the history of technology, and by the way, Apple are brilliant at this, it's not invention, it's finding novel use of something. In the 1960s, I effectively, in that they were worldwide market leaders in using punch cards to control industrial machines. And so they repurposed that capability to create the first computer programming mechanism. That gave them advantage. So under conditions of uncertainty, exaptation is a better innovation strategy than primary innovation. It's better to find out what you know and then radically repurpose it to get advantage. One of the other on this is that we know that music and painting came before language in human evolution. Now, that's probably an accident. Most things in evolution are accidents, but then it develops in human beings in a very advanced way, because art allows us to move away from the real into the abstract. And that actually is what makes human beings inventive, because if you move into the abstract, you can see novel or unusual connections between things. And that's why a lot of us are worried, focus on STEM education for engineering students. Because if you don't have people who are artists who study the humanities, we'll lose that human capacity, inventiveness, which is going to be critical to our survival. I mean, global warming, not going to have time to do primary invention. We're going to have to find ways to repurpose existing technology very quickly in order to do new things. And we also do work, by the way, on repurposing existing cultures. And in the chaotic domain, and to finish off now, all you do is accents respond, which means actually you can do completely novel things. There's as good as a crisis for radical reinvention. The other use of chaos, which is actually quite useful, and this will link in with what I'm going to talk about, one of the roles of cultural institutions and art institutions, as I conclude the talk, is that if you can actually have multiple agents all making decisions independently of other agents, i.e. absence of constraint, you've got a very effective decision support mechanism. Now, in the popular literature, this is called wisdom of crowds. So if you get a group of farmers to guess the weight of a cow, at a fair or a market or something, the average of all the farmers' guesses will be better than the guess of the best individual. There are conditions that work. One is to be farmers. Tacit knowing. It's people with deep experience of animals who can do this. Secondly, none of the farmers must know what the other farmers have guessed. Each guess must be connected and constrained. And thirdly, it must be a game. If there's too much at stake, they won't do it. That's how it works, all right? The other famous example is a United States submarine which grounded off the coast of Portugal in the 1960s. Nobody knew where it was. So they gave partial data to different groups of experts around the world to estimate its position, and they didn't allow them to talk to each other. And probability, none of the guesses were remotely near it, but a distribution of all of the guesses was within 6 meters of the submarine's location. Now, we now do that on citizen engagement, for example, or employee engagement. If I have 1,000 employees, 500 citizens in a village or whatever, is by presenting situations to them and get them to interpret it in real time. We can actually identify dominant views and minority views and critically outlier views. So one last bit of science on that to emphasize the importance. If you give radiologists a batch of X-rays and ask them to look for anomalies, on the final X-ray you put a picture of a gorilla which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, then on average 83% of radiologists will not see the gorilla, even though their eyes physically scan it, and the 7% who do come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 80%. So one of the ways which we use actually to find thinking differently about the problem, and those people you know. So this is one of 3 aspects of the EU field guide. I'll run through them quickly, then talk about art specifically. So first of all, you need to start to use your customers, your employees, your citizens, whatever you can get access to, as what's called a human sensor network. You need them to be involved in real-time situational assessment and real-time scenario, micro-scenario planning in terms of the way forward. And with technology, that's actually easy. It's using technology to enable intelligence rather than try and replace it. So that we can do, which is the second thing is building informal networks. Informal networks are actually more effective in a crisis than formal systems because they're what are called context-free information channels. And the third thing in the EU field is storing what you know at the right level of granularity so you can repurpose it very quickly in crisis. And that's actually interesting, where you use people with a very different temperament from an engineering temperament to actually do that work. So talk about the projects to get illustration of some of the done in this area. So engaging citizens is really important, and it's important for the future. And we know that things like opinion polls and questionnaires don't work because they're too explicit. And so this is work we originally developed for the US government over 20 years ago now in the field of counterterrorism, where we were looking for weak signal detection. So you spot which benefit of hindsight were highly significant, but you don't pay attention to the time. So that was a sort of background for this development. So one of the things we've done now in Sweden, in South Wales, in Colombia, in Egypt, in Libya, is to use children as ethnographers of their own communities. And in South Wales, we did this through cultural centres, through art centres. They all had youth problems, youth programs. They had a need to engage youth, and that was particularly true post-COVID because they couldn't come together quickly, but they still had access to those kids. And what we did was to actually give them an app by which they could become journalists to their own environment. During COVID, that was particularly important. You need to gather stories from adults and tell stories to children they won't tell to researchers. You need to record those experiences. So effectively from that, we could draw narrative maps or narrative landscapes. They look like contour maps, which gave us an indication of strong and weak patterns. We could push out to that work. So here's a situation, what do you all think about it? And from that, produce another which showed dominant views, minority views, and outlier views to actually inform decision making. And then we did something even, which I think was even more useful, is we used what's called generational. So we put people trained in how software, that incentive for them wanted to be trained. But if they formed a pair with somebody from their grandparent generation, yeah, and they worked. Now, there were sound evolutionary reasons for that, by the way, in terms of brain plasticity. The brain is very plastic up until your early 20s, and it locks down based on the norms of your society. It becomes more open in 50s and 60s. And you can see why that happens. After you've got to hunt the tribe and adopt members of the tribe. If you into your late 50s, then you can't live anymore. You go wisdom business because you've obviously something more about all the guys who died the route. So what we found is that we had young people with ideas coupled with old people who had networks and practical ideas, and came up with ideas for improvements in the community. And if they came up with good ideas, then we put to a trio, somebody from the government who could make that work. And that created a network framework based around the Artificial Centre, which has to inform government. And we're deploying that same technique in the US to look at conflict resolution. The election, which was a traumatic election for the Americans, that divides us between Democrat and Republican, between blue and red. So what we're doing there is we've got schools and cultural centres and religious groups. Their young people are acting as ethnographers to their own communities, gathering stories from those communities, looking for clusters of micro-narrative which agree problems in blue and red, and put in small teams of blue and red people onto those problems which they already share to solve real problems in their community and allow the conversations about their differences to emerge naturally over time. This big switch, talk and then do, and then we go to and then to, yeah? And that actually works on indigenous knowledge and everywhere else. Now that's something we're about to create as a major program. It also linked in with the work we're working on with the European Commission at the moment, which is a big program with 3 participants. And what we're doing there is to effectively get a mechanism by which artists can provide either sculptures or pictures or drawings or cartoons, music, which allow people to navigate through these micro-narratives of people's day-to-day existence. And we're building that at what will be culture walls for museums, for organizations, for schools, government. And that's based on what we originally did with Liverpool Museum. If you ever go to Liverpool, probably one of the best museums in the country is the Slavery Museum. Bristol and Liverpool in Britain were the slave ports. The whole wealth is based on slavery. You know, the triangle which went, goods to Africa, slaves to Africa, back to the US, back to the UK. Now, they're extremely. They actually have names in Penny, which was made famous by the Beatles. You then turn that round and you see that it was named after Captain Penny. You turn that round and you see how slave he made and how he threw over how many people he creates a perspective. They have a recreated hold of a slave ship, and children go there, they're together so they feel what it was like if they were slaves. with the smells and the noise and everything else. And, you know, it's an incredible place. Particularly people, it's well worth looking at. And what we've done there is to take the narratives and create walls. So the narratives of people's experience of the museum then also become a part of the exhibit. So I'm Welsh and also white and male. I suffered slavery. I have to go back 2 generations. My grandmother, well, I'll tell a story because it's relevant. My grandmother, the English did, the Welsh educated, very nice of them, but they said it had to be English. So if my grandmother ever spoke Welsh in school, she had a wooden badge around the neck called the Welsh knot. And then she had to find one of her friends speaking Welsh and she could hand over the knot. And whoever wore the knot at the end of the day got thrashed by the teacher. Yeah, that's something everybody in Wales knows, but nobody in England. It's a common process. You'll find that imperial powers try and destroy culture, destroy language, destroy ethnic arts, and that's part of the process. And yeah, but I didn't suffer that. It was my grandparents who did. I am interested in the story that somebody from descendant of slaves feels when they first go into the museum, because that's part of complex experience which will inform me in the way we work. So I think there's a lot of things that we can do once we start to get this principle of complexity, which is about network distribution, emergent meaning. So starting to use young people as ethnographers is something that can be done during lockdown, but can be centered on cultural aspects or anything else. We're actually the Ministry of in Singapore around using children as ethnographers on health issues. So starting to use those networks, starting to use what you've got effectively as a sensor map means understanding, yeah, is actually very important. And starting to get people to realize the role in culture. And then that gets quite interesting. So drawing cultural maps is fascinating. One of the ways we do that, for example, is we present a series of cartoons, all of which are apparatic. Yeah, they're paradoxical. They don't allow you to look at what's right or wrong. And people choose the cartoon which represents how they feel about the company, their country, their community, their city, whatever. Tell a story about why they did that, and then interpret that story into what's called high abstraction metadata. It can't be gained. And from that, we can draw culture maps for that community. And again, those culture maps are like contour maps. So they indicate dominant views, minority views. But critical also indicate where there are things common between people who differ. And that ability to use abstraction art to find new ways to bring people together or in conflict is actually really important, or to recognize when conflict is inevitable and it can't be immediately resolved. Yeah? Give you another example from my own history. I was working on peace and conflict resolution in Northern Ireland in the 70s. This is the time we had what are called the Troubles, and we had army presence. It was actually very dangerous. And I remember I was in a Catholic area. I got picked up by the police. I mean, the state, they were all Protestant. And after my legs did, I want shot first, and then they hit my accent to realise they came from Britain, not from. So I got threatened to Land Rover. So it wasn't a good place. And they were attempting peace and reconciliation by bringing together in big session to, what they had in idea to throw petrol bombs at each other. Everybody felt happy at the end of the workshop. Within 2 weeks, throwing petrol against each other, we changed the context. What we did as a graduate at the time, that's a effect for this. We took people from both communities in small groups of 3, for instance, 1 Catholic, 2 Catholics. And we dumped them into development projects in the slums of Rio de Janeiro. And we didn't talk about the Troubles. And they discovered very quickly they had more in common than they thought. And then they started to talk about their political and religious differences while they were doing things in common, and they had lasting relationships, which through things like the Good Friday Agreement. So this process of engagement is key to understanding complexity. So what I've tried to do is finish off by giving you some examples of work we're currently doing. Cultural institutions, cultural ministries. It's actually really powerful. We're working on a big program at the moment, which theoretically could have every school in every country in the world acting as ethnographers to their own condition to give immediate real-time feedback loop to government. If anybody's interested in that, get in touch, because we're looking for the test sites on that. And that also gives a new purpose. So a museum or an arts institution doesn't become something to be funded because you think it's a good idea. It becomes something which is providing concrete and tangible value to the development of society beyond art itself, which of course is value in its own right. So I've tried to do some illustrations of that. I talked about the Liverpool Museums project, I talked about the new European project, which is going to be public and it's available to everybody. I talked about the work we've done with citizen engagement in terms of involving young people through art centres or whatever. And before that, I went through the fundamental Cynefin framework with its 5 points. The key principle there, and I'll finish with this, is to move away from what are called context-free solutions, move into context-specific. So things which were ordered systems, not working systems, and vice versa. And we need to diverse, understand where, and then do different things in different spaces. So that's the Cynefin framework. That's aspects of ethnography. That's aspect of finding new ways to use color. I hope that's been useful, and I hate speaking without looking at an audience because I get feedback. All right, open to.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. Can you please mute yourself while I'm saying my questions to you? Yeah, so that we didn't have double sound. So thank you, first of all, thank you for this presentation. I hope this will encourage people to go and check your framework in more details and try to use it in real life and implement some advices that you mentioned during your presentation. I wanted to ask you one question about the COVID and the pandemic situation, and maybe you could give some specific example where some country or some country leaders made chose the correct strategy in this chaotic COVID situation last year, for example, with vaccination or with testing people, etc., and vice versa, an example of country which used inappropriate strategies. So one example with the correct strategy and one was not the best, probably, if to follow the logic of your framework.
I partly gave one earlier with New Zealand, in that they did lockdown very quickly, and that kept options open, and the number of deaths they had was far less. Yeah, and then also moved in partial containment and they proper tracing system. All right, now, so that meant they listened to the epidemiologists. I mean, we know how to handle plagues; it's been studied, right? And they've done some of that in Australia as well. So, for example, when they got a D variant strain in Melbourne, they locked down the whole of Melbourne for 3 days. Well, they tracked everybody in contact, isolated, then they opened up again. Yeah? So there are good examples of how to do it, and there are countries that did it well. If you want an example of a country who did it bad, come to mind. All right, so in Sweden, or Britain and the US and Brazil, leaders at the time, and they're all a disaster because basically they didn't want to shut down. They didn't want to do something which wasn't popular. So by the time they did it, you know, several tens of thousands of people who died who didn't need to die. And then they opened up, right? And then they closed down again, right? And so they never got it right. And we're about 19th of July. We're going to open up Britain And we don't need to get rid of things like masks, but they've just decided, I think, to be honest, our Prime Minister is bored because he has very low tolerance for ambiguity. He just wants it over, so he's going to pretend it's over, right? That's actually quite dangerous. And COVID is a matter of managing and flexing the constraints. Yeah? Now, it's more difficult. In actual fact, I'm contrasting Britain and New Zealand because they have more options because they're island nations. So we got this big thing called the English Channel, and they've got the Tasman Sea. It's much more difficult if you're in continental Europe because it's much more difficult to actually control input and access, and you need to think differently about that. Right? But I think that's where these sort of, I mean, I wrote a paper 5 years ago when we were first bidding to get every child in every school in the world as a photographer. And I said, one of the reasons that we need this is if we ever have a pandemic, we need a distributed sensor network to give us real-time feedback on what people's attitudes are, because attitudes are lead indicators. That's a much better measure of future behavior.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Dave. Can you please mute yourself one more time? Because I have one more question to you. And it's about the topic. We'll go deeper into it in our next keynote speech. We'll have it's about the leadership style. So how exactly should I, as a leader or as a manager or as a person responsible for the team or organization, should change my behavior and management approaches maybe in a situation when I see that we are moving to chaotic situation and we are going to a chaotic environment. What should be my practical steps and how should my leadership style change in this case?
Somebody started to ring me, so I had to stop. I think there's an overemphasis in Northern Europe and North America, and I've said this several times in the Ukraine. You need to look yourselves at America. Right? There's an emphasis, on the individual and the individual leader, and less collective. And you see lists of leadership behaviors and leadership characteristics, which are actually emergent properties, right? So I would not go down the route of leadership competences. I've given you the field that says something very simple, right? The role of leadership generally, and the higher up you go, the more this is the case, is coordinate, decide. Yeah, so you effectively distribute decision making, central. Being a C-level of it is linking and connectable. The only time that's different is when a crisis hits, where you have to make decisions because you haven't got time to involve people. And that way you have to be quite draconian. And in that context, what you actually do is you impose structure to open up options. Now, I would do leadership in terms of what you do, and that's a general principle of complexity. So we don't have common purpose or common vision statements. We have stories about what we don't want to be, which leave open possibility of novelty within the system. So that would be a brief summary on leadership.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this answer. This is an interesting, I would say, comment to probably start with our next speaker. And let me thank you one more time for your speech. I really encourage all of our listeners to check Dave's blog website, Cognitive Age. So you can see the link in the chat. I also welcome you to check the report or the guide on managing the complexity, which was prepared by Dave and his team in cooperation with the European Union. As well, I welcome you to follow the link and go to Harvard Business Review and check the article, which is pretty detailed and has all the guidelines how to use this Cynefin framework and how to use this approach to decision making. in complex and complicated and chaotic situations. So Dave, thank you one more time for being today with us. And thank you for all your interesting examples and metaphors you had during your speech. That was very interesting and useful for all of us. And thank you for your time. And now, colleagues, we will have a short break and we will come back at 12:30 actually. So you will have a chance to grab a cup of tea, coffee, or water if it's hot outside in your country. And yeah, by the way, Dave, I see that there are warm greetings to you from Institute of Leadership and Management from the Ukrainian Catholic University. If you would like to, this
I was just Ted like to come back.
Yeah. So Salomia, you heard Dave is happy to come back, and Dave, we will be happy to have you more on our events in Ukraine and physically as well. Hopefully, this will be more and more possible this year already.